The hall of alabaster and gold hummed with restrained power as Marcus Hale stood where no human had ever been meant to stand. Light poured from vaulted arches and broke across polished floors like water over stone. He could feel the attention of 1,000 alien eyes without seeing them turn. Armor whispered as guards shifted weight in ceremonial patience. At the center dais, the alien queen observed everything with stillness that felt deliberate. Marcus kept his shoulders square and his breathing slow as he had been trained. This was a reception meant to test fear more than etiquette. Marcus had been invited as an observer, a harmless title that fooled no one in the room. Humans had survived first contact by choosing words carefully and silence more carefully still. He remembered the briefing that morning and the warning about humor. Humor did not translate well across species or power hierarchies. Yet the tension pressed on him like altitude sickness, thin and dizzying. When a noble hissed a cutting remark about human fragility, the sound sliced the air. Before Marcus could stop himself, his mouth moved faster than protocol allowed. He said the line lightly, almost to himself, about how even fragile things endure when guarded well. The words were meant to diffuse, not to provoke, a human reflex from old negotiations. For a heartbeat, nothing happened and Marcus felt cold relief. Then metal rang once as the queen's bodyguard stepped forward. The guardian was tall even among her kind, armor mirror bright and severe. Her eyes locked on Marcus with startling clarity rather than anger. The hall went silent in a way that felt ceremonial rather than shocked. The guardian spoke in a voice trained for command and ritual. She declared him her husband according to ancient warding law. Gasps rippled outward like a dropped bowl shattering invisibly. Marcus felt heat rush to his face as translation glyphs flared around him. He tried to speak, but protocol seized his tongue with legal delay. The queen tilted her head, interest replacing neutrality with unsettling ease. In that moment, Marcus realized the joke had crossed into binding territory. The queen's gaze weighed outcomes the way engineers weighed load limits. Marcus felt suddenly small and very human under that attention. The guardian remained motionless, posture formal, awaiting acknowledgement. Marcus searched her face for mockery and found only certainty. He had studied alien honor codes, but none had mentioned marriage by proclamation. His implant finally released his voice, and the room seemed to lean closer. He asked for clarification with careful humility that masked rising panic. The guardian explained with ritual precision, each word ringing like struck glass. A verbal defense offered publicly invoked protection claim. Protection claim accepted created mutual obligation. Mutual obligation under oath equaled bonded partnership. The law existed to prevent blood feuds among the Queen's Guard. No one had considered a human would ever trigger it. The Queen's smile curved slowly, a gesture that carried history. Marcus felt the room's calculus change around him. He was no longer an observer, but a variable with consequences. The Queen asked him whether he wished to challenge the claim. To do so would imply distrust of her guardian's honor. Human survival instincts screamed, but empathy steadied his answer. He chose respect over retreat, words shaped by shared vulnerability. He accepted provisional bond pending formal review. A murmur passed through the court like wind through banners. The guardian inclined her head, braid shifting against polished armor. Marcus noticed then how carefully maintained the armor was, not ornamental but lived in. The Queen rose, and the sound of it commanded the space. She declared the bond recognized under royal oversight. Human delegates stared in stunned calculation from the periphery. Marcus felt history pivot on a sentence he had never planned to say. As the assembly resumed in altered rhythm, Marcus walked beside the guardian. She introduced herself with a name that translated as shield that stands. He offered his own name and felt it echo strangely in the chamber. She explained that the law valued intent more than species. His joke had carried intent to protect dignity, and that mattered. Marcus wondered when empathy had become a legal force. The thought steadied him even as uncertainty grew. They moved through corridors where light dimmed into pearl shadow. Servants bowed with new complexity in their expressions. Marcus felt the weight of implication settle into his steps. The guardian spoke softly now, explaining boundaries and expectations. There was no romance in her tone, only responsibility. That honesty felt like a lifeline across cultures. Marcus listened and learned as fast as he could. He realized then that humanity's strength had never been raw power. It was the instinct to answer tension with connection. In a court built on dominance, he had offered deflection instead of defiance. The law had recognized that as worth guarding. The guardian paused and looked at him with measured curiosity. She asked why humans joked when afraid. Marcus answered simply that it helped them remember they were together. Her nod was slow, thoughtful, as if filing a valuable datum. They reached a balcony overlooking the capital's living spires. The city breathed light and motion like a single organism. Marcus felt a push aside fear in his chest. If this bond held, it would reshape more than his life. It would test whether empathy could scale to empires. He squared his shoulders again, ready to be tested. The balcony air carried a cool metallic scent as Marcus stood beside shield that stands and watched the capital breathe. Living towers unfurled translucent petals that caught the light and folded again. Traffic flowed along invisible lanes, guided by hums he felt more than heard. Marcus rested his hands on the rail to steady himself against scale and consequence. Shield that stands remained composed, armor reflecting the city like a quiet mirror. She explained that recognition had shifted his legal gravity within the court. Marcus listened, knowing every word now had weight beyond intent. They were escorted through layered halls where protocol unfolded like origami. Officials bowed with precise angles calibrated to status changes still computing. Marcus sensed curiosity rather than hostility, which felt like a fragile mercy. Shield that stands answered questions before they were asked, her timing impeccable. She clarified that provisional bonds required public conduct assessments. Human humor would be examined for destabilizing potential. Marcus almost smiled and then decided not to. In a chamber shaped like a shell, they met the Queen's legal mind. It manifested as a lattice of light that pulsed with measured patience. The lattice spoke in harmonics that his implant smoothed into meaning. It asked Marcus to recount the joke and his intent. He described the moment honestly, fear included, without embellishment. The lattice brightened at the mention of protecting dignity. Shield that stands watched, unreadable, as data resolved. The lattice concluded that intent aligned with warding precedent. It warned that outcomes could not be undone by regret. Marcus accepted the truth of that with a slow breath. The Queen entered quietly, presence preceding sound by a heartbeat. She addressed Marcus as bonded guest, a title both generous and binding. Her interest focused on human adaptability rather than compliance. Marcus felt seen rather than sized up, which surprised him. The Queen proposed a trial of coexistence measured in shared tasks. If Marcus and Shield that stands could coordinate under pressure, the bond would stand. Failure would dissolve it without dishonor, though consequences would ripple. Marcus agreed, recognizing a familiar human test structure. Shield that stands acknowledged with formal assent and a brief glance his way. The trial would begin immediately, because courts valued momentum. They were given a mission framed as maintenance but laced with risk. A border relay had gone silent in a sector prone to ion storms. The relay regulated migration lanes used by multiple species. If it failed completely, ships would scatter or collide. The Queen assigned them joint authority to restore function. Marcus understood the subtext about trust forged through action. Shield that stands outlined approach options with crisp efficiency. Marcus contributed by translating human improvisation into clear contingencies. Their transport detached like a thought becoming motion. Acceleration pressed Marcus into his harness while light streaked. Shield that stands monitored systems without visible strain. She asked about human training under uncertainty. Marcus explained drills that rewarded initiative over obedience. She absorbed this, correlating it to her guard doctrines. Silence settled into comfortable focus rather than distance. The relay emerged from storm haze like a wounded animal. Arcs of energy crawled across its hull and vanished. Sensors flickered, feeding unreliable telemetry. Shield that stands recommended an external inspection first. Marcus proposed anchoring with redundant tethers to compensate for drift. They merged plans without friction, each adjusting to the other. The transport stabilized and opened its bay with a shudder. Outside, the storm tasted like charged snow on Marcus's tongue. He followed Shield that stands onto the hull, magnetic boots humming. She moved with economy, every gesture conserving energy. Marcus traced power conduits, noting burn patterns. He recognized a cascading failure familiar from human stations. A manual bypass could reroute load if timed correctly. He explained with gestures and clipped phrases over comms. Shield that stands positioned herself as anchor while Marcus worked. The storm surged, testing their tethers with sudden force. Marcus counted beats, waiting for the lull between pulses. He acted in that narrow window, hands steady despite fear. Power rerouted and the relay's lights steadied briefly. Another surge threatened to undo the fix immediately. Shield that stands adjusted stance, sharing the load without comment. They retreated inside as alarms softened into monitoring tones. The relay's core stabilized, lanes recalculating across sectors. Marcus exhaled laughter he hadn't meant to release. Shield that stands regarded him with something like approval. She noted that timing had mattered more than strength. Marcus replied that trust made timing possible. The words landed with quiet resonance between them. On the return flight, the storm fell away behind them. Marcus felt exhaustion settle in layers rather than all at once. Shield that stands debriefed with the Queen's channel, concise and precise. The Queen responded with measured satisfaction and a hint of amusement. She observed that human improvisation paired well with guard resolve. Marcus felt pride tempered by awareness of scrutiny. The trial had passed its first measure. Back in the capital, reaction rippled faster than news feeds. Some praised efficiency, others questioned precedent. Marcus met both with the same steady openness. Shield that stands remained a constant presence at his side. She explained nuances of court sentiment as they walked. Marcus offered parallels from human diplomacy to contextualize. They learned each other's maps by overlaying them. That evening, they shared a quiet meal prepared for mixed biology. Marcus described earth foods that balanced comfort and nutrition. Shield that stands shared guard rations designed for endurance. They laughed softly at the contrast without mockery. Marcus realized humor could bridge rather than provoke when shared intentionally. Shield that stands asked if marriage meant expectation of intimacy. Marcus answered with honesty about choice and consent. She considered this carefully, then nodded. Her culture-bound duty first, feeling later if at all. Marcus respected that boundary without disappointment. The bond, he realized, was a framework not a script. If it endured, it would do so by mutual design. He felt calmer with that understanding. Outside, the capital dimmed into night rhythms. The Queen summoned them once more before rest cycles. She acknowledged their success and extended the trial. Public sentiment would watch closely, she warned. Marcus accepted with humility, shield that stands with formality. The Queen's gaze lingered on Marcus with thoughtful calculation. She asked what humans hoped to gain from the stars. Marcus replied that they hoped to belong without vanishing. The Queen smiled, a rare curve that softened the room. She dismissed them with a gesture that felt like permission. As they departed, Marcus felt the bond settle into place. Not as chain or crown but as shared responsibility. Shield that stands spoke once more on the threshold. She said that husbands, by her law, protected truth. Marcus promised to do exactly that. Dawn in the capital arrived as a gradual warming of color rather than a sudden light. Marcus woke to the hum of the residence systems adjusting for his biology. Shield that stands was already awake, seated in meditation posture near the window. Her presence grounded the room with a quiet sense of readiness. Marcus stretched slowly, aware that every movement was observed somewhere. The bond trial had entered a new phase without announcement. Uncertainty settled in his chest like a held breath. They were summoned to a forum overlooking the lower districts. Below, layered habitats shimmered with activity and soft industrial rhythm. The queen waited there with advisors arranged like constellations. Marcus felt the weight of anticipation in the stillness. Shield that stands stood at his right, armor pristine and familiar. The queen spoke of unrest spreading along the migration lanes. A faction questioned why a human held bonded status at all. Marcus listened as arguments were outlined with elegant restraint. Powerful voices feared dilution of tradition. Others feared escalation if precedent went untested. The queen proposed a public demonstration of the bond's value. Not spectacle, but service visible to all strata. Marcus recognized the human equivalent of a confidence mission. Shield that stands accepted the framing without hesitation. The task involved a disputed district where species boundaries overlapped. Infrastructure there had grown organically, not by royal design. Tensions flared easily, and authority was often mistrusted. Marcus understood this landscape instinctively from Earth cities. He suggested beginning with listening rather than enforcement. Some advisors bristled at the idea of restraint. The queen allowed it, curious rather than convinced. They arrived amid layered sounds of commerce and argument. Stalls glowed with bioluminescent goods and mechanical wares. Marcus felt eyes tracking him with open suspicion. Shield that stands adjusted her stance to signal protection without threat. A dispute erupted nearby between two crews over docking priority. Marcus stepped forward before protocol could freeze him. He raised his hands and spoke calmly, inviting explanation. At first, voices overlapped in sharp cadence. Marcus listened, repeating key points to show understanding. He reframed the conflict around shared risk rather than blame. Shield that stands translated his intent into guard sign language. The crews hesitated, surprised by the absence of force. A compromise emerged about staggered access windows. Tension eased like pressure vented safely. Word spread quickly through the district. More disputes were brought to them voluntarily. Marcus felt exhaustion creep in as hours passed. Shield that stands remained steady, offering presence and authority. Together they modeled cooperation rather than dominance. Observers transmitted footage across the capital. Public sentiment began to tilt perceptibly. A challenge came when a provocation was staged deliberately. A radical shouted that the bond was a farce. The crowd tightened, emotions spiking dangerously. Marcus felt fear surge but stayed rooted. He responded not with rebuttal but vulnerability. He admitted fear and the cost of mistakes. The honesty disarmed more effectively than rhetoric. Shield that stands stepped forward then, voice carrying ritual weight. She declared that honor was measured by outcomes for the many. If the bond failed, she would answer for it. The declaration silenced the crowd with its gravity. Marcus felt the depth of her commitment land fully. The radical withdrew, momentum broken. Relief rippled outward like a tide. By cycle's end, the district breathed easier. Temporary accords held, and trust tentatively grew. Marcus and Shield that stands returned to the forum. Advisors reported metrics shifting in their favor. The queen considered the data and the unquantifiable. She asked Marcus what he had learned. He answered that respect scaled when modeled sincerely. That night, alone again, Marcus reflected quietly. The bond no longer felt accidental. It felt chosen, shaped by response to pressure. Shield that stands acknowledged this with a rare softening of posture. They spoke of future challenges without illusion. Both understood scrutiny would intensify, not fade. Yet resolve settled between them like shared ground. The capital shifted into alert cadence without sirens or panic. Marcus felt it first as a change in airflow and light temperature. Shield that stands stiffened, receiving encrypted guard signals through her armor. A coordinated disruption had begun across multiple districts simultaneously. The timing was deliberate, meant to fracture the fragile trust they had built. The Queen summoned them not to the throne hall but to a strategic overlook. This was no longer a test of symbolism but of survival. Data streams unfolded in layered projections around them. Transit lanes stuttered and rerouted, causing localized congestion and fear. False alerts spread faster than official corrections. Marcus recognized the pattern from human information warfare. The enemy was not force but confusion amplified. He requested permission to speak freely without protocol lag. The Queen granted it with a single nod. Marcus proposed a counter that relied on transparency over suppression. Open channels staffed by mixed-species teams could deflate rumor momentum. Shield that stands added guard authority to validate the channels instantly. Advisors debated risks of exposure and loss of control. Marcus argued that control was already lost to uncertainty. Human history supported the claim with hard-earned scars. The Queen weighed cost against cascading failure and agreed. They moved quickly into action nodes across the city. Marcus coordinated messaging frameworks while Shield that stands secured relays. They paired local voices with verified data in real time. Crowds calmed as answers replaced speculation. Attempts to inject panic were isolated and flagged publicly. The transparency made manipulation visible and less potent. Marcus felt momentum turn like a tide under moon pull. A final escalation targeted the bond itself. A broadcast accused Shield that stands of compromised loyalty. Marcus felt the sting of personal attack sharpen the air. Shield that stands requested permission to respond personally. The Queen allowed it, watching carefully. Shield that stands addressed the city with measured clarity. She affirmed duty, outcome, and shared responsibility without defensiveness. Marcus followed, speaking not as envoy but as partner. He acknowledged the fear behind the accusation. He explained how trust was not blind but built through action. He invited scrutiny and accountability rather than rejection. The response resonated across channels in steady waves. The attack lost energy, starved of outrage. Systems stabilized as the city exhaled. In the aftermath, exhaustion arrived honestly. Marcus leaned against a railing as the city lights normalized. Shield that stands stood close enough to share balance without touching. The Queen approached, presence calm and evaluative. She declared the decisive phase complete. The bond had moved from provisional to consequential. Its final judgment would follow rest and reflection. Later, in quiet quarters, Marcus processed the day. He recognized how human adaptability had complemented alien discipline. Neither alone would have sufficed. Shield that stands acknowledged this symmetry openly. She admitted her culture underestimated flexibility as strength. Marcus admitted humans underestimated structure as mercy. They shared a moment of mutual recalibration. As night deepened, the capital rested. Marcus felt the weight of what remained unresolved. The bond would either reshape law or be reshaped by it. Shield that stands prepared for whatever outcome awaited. They stood together at the window once more. Not by accident now but by choice under pressure. The city reflected that choice back at them in light. Morning unfolded gently across the capital, a deliberate easing after strain. Marcus watched the light warm the edges of the city as if reassurance were a civic service. He felt tired in a way that came from responsibility rather than fear. Shield that stands stood beside him, armor set aside, presence unchanged. Without the shell, her bearing remained resolute and calm. The bond had altered how the city saw them and how they saw each other. Today would decide whether change hardened into law or softened into legacy. They were called before the Queen at a quieter hour than ceremony preferred. No crowds waited, no advisors crowded the air with projections. The Queen chose intimacy of scale to match the gravity of choice. Marcus noted the absence of spectacle with gratitude. Shield that stands knelt in traditional posture, then rose at the Queen's signal. Marcus followed the protocol he had learned through practice and trust. Silence settled like a held chord before resolution. The Queen spoke of precedent and consequence with measured cadence. She acknowledged resistance that would not vanish with one success. She also acknowledged outcomes that had saved lives and dignity. Law, she said, was a living structure that learned from stress. The bond had been stress applied with unexpected care. Marcus felt the weight of that recognition land cleanly. Shield that stands remained steady, eyes forward, breath even. The Queen offered a choice framed as responsibility rather than reward. The bond could be affirmed fully, reshaping guard law to include intent. Or it could be honored and dissolved, lessons retained without permanence. Marcus considered the paths without rushing his answer. He thought of the district voices and the relay lights steadying. He thought of humor that had opened a door and truth that had held it. He chose affirmation, aware of the work it implied. Shield that stands echoed the choice with formal assent. She spoke of duty expanded rather than diminished. The Queen accepted both declarations with a nod that carried history. She decreed the law amended, narrowly and carefully. Intent would be recognized as a protective force when proven by action. The court would resist and adapt in equal measure. Change, the Queen said, deserved patience and guardianship. Word traveled quickly despite the hour. Reactions varied from cautious approval to anxious debate. Marcus met each message with the same transparency he had learned to trust. Shield that stands answered challenges with consistency and presence. Together they became a reference point rather than a symbol alone. The city adjusted, not all at once, but enough. Momentum mattered less now than continuity. In the days that followed, their roles clarified. Marcus served as bridge, translating uncertainty into shared plans. Shield that stands trained teams in protocols that valued judgment alongside discipline. They learned each other's rhythms in small decisions and quiet pauses. There was no rush toward romance, only respect growing sturdier. The bond became practice before it became promise. That felt right to both of them. Marcus reflected, often on the joke that had started everything. It had not been clever, only human. He understood now that humor had worked because it carried care. Care scaled when institutions allowed it to be seen. The Queen watched these developments with measured satisfaction. Empires, she believed, survived by updating their definitions of strength. Humanity, she observed, updated through connection. One evening, as the capital breathed into night again, Marcus asked a question. He wondered aloud what Shield that stands wanted beyond duty. She considered, then said she wanted outcomes that lasted. Not glory, not exception, but reliability under strain. Marcus recognized the answer as kin to his own hopes. They stood at the window, city lights threading below. Partnership, they agreed, was maintenance as much as meaning. The bond settled into the city's law and into their lives. Not as a story of conquest or destiny, but of calibration. Humans were special, Marcus realized, not because they bent others. They were special because they bent themselves toward understanding under pressure. That trait had found a home among the stars. Shield that stands rested her hand briefly at his shoulder. The city reflected that quiet certainty back at them.